Dear friends, welcome to the second in a series of 2 bonus episodes of the podcast The Way Out Is In.
The way out is in.
I'm Jo Confino, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce this second panel discussion at a recent retreat in Plum Village called Ancient Path for Modern Times. The panel was based around what are known as the 14 mindfulness trainings, which were written by Thich Nhat Hanh in 1966 in Saigon, and were really his vision of a global ethic, a way of living life that brings peace, harmony, and joy to our lives. And the 14 mindfulness trainings are actually a modern distillation of the traditional Bodhisattva precepts of Mahayana Buddhism. And to give you an idea of some of the 14, they include openness, non-attachment to views, freedom of thought, compassionate living, taking care of one's anger, building community, generosity, and true love. And the 14 mindfulness trainings are taken by monastics and lay friends who have made a vow in a formal ceremony to receive, study, and observe the trainings. And they are known as members of the Order of Interbeing. And there are actually now more than 2,000 lay women and men who are members of the Order of Interbeing. And in this episode, we have 3 people. We have Sister Lang Nghiem, who is one of the senior nuns in Plum Village. We have my good self, so I am there, and you probably know who I am, so I don't need to introduce myself, and that's always a bit weird. But lastly, we have Elli Weisbaum, and she is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And she has, from a very young age, spent time in Plum Village in the children's program with the teenagers, and then now as a young adult. She has worked internationally facilitating mindfulness workshops and retreats within the sectors of education, healthcare, and business. And this conversation really focuses around what it is to feel safe in the world, what it is to belong, what it is like to feel at home in the world. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Meditation Hall, Upper Hamlet, for part 2 of our panel sharing, dialogue around the 14 mindfulness trainings and our applications and practices in our personal, professional, community lives. And to my right, we have Jo Confino, and next to Jo is Elli. But first, Jo, I'm quite curious. Yesterday when we were talking about the title of the retreat, An Ancient Path for Modern Times, you were kind of joking, but it wasn't really a joke. You were like, well, I feel it's more like modern times to ancient path. And I'm just curious why you said that, and yeah.
I always like to play with words. So we always think in a linear way, or tend to think in a linear way. So it's ancient paths to modern times. And I just like to say, well, if I turn that round, is that still relevant? And I think it is, because I think, and you teach beautifully about this, about time. We think of time as linear. But I think the way we meet these modern times also nourishes the ancient paths. And I think that in some ways, and we may talk about this more, that the time that we are living and moving into and the dangers ahead means that actually we will need to rely on the teachings, the Dharma, the 14 mindfulness trainings, and actually find new paths within those. And as we do that, what we will do is we will transmit those back through the generations and renew the ancient paths as well. And I've always found Thai's teachings on ancestors to be very, very powerful. And one of the things I've learned is that when we transform or heal things in the present moment, we don't just heal them in the present moment, we heal them in the present moment, and we heal it in the past, and we heal it in the future. And so often in our modern system, we're looking ahead. We're looking at how do we, if we act now, what will it do for the future? And I like to also think, by acting now, what do we do for the past? How do we also honor all these people who have come before us, who have walked this path, who have met their challenges, and how do we honor them in the present moment? And by honoring them, we enliven them.
Just to go one level deeper, can you share a little bit what you are, maybe something that's very alive for you right now in terms of healing the past? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel I'm deep in process at the moment. One of the wonderful monks came to me yesterday and asked me 2 or 3 very deep questions that sort of set me off. And what I came to realize just in those few moments is that actually since October the 7th of last year, I've actually been in a state of shock and depression. And there are many, and what I'm realizing is that there's very personal issues that have come up for me, but also it's touching into, for me, deep collective issues. And the deep collective issues are then reverberating back into my personal understanding and personal way I'm experiencing life at the moment. So until October the 7th, I was reasonably happy. I felt balanced and reasonably content with life, and things felt to be good. And on that day, it was in the middle of the climate leaders retreat here in Plum Village. And I walked up to my wife, Paz, with a sort of, with my tail sort of wagging in a sort of all this sort of enthusiastic way. And she said, there's a war in Israel. And I remember just feeling this sort of sense of shock. And I want to tread carefully here, because the first thing I want to say is that, and it's important to say, I'm completely horrified by what's happening in Gaza. Every day I feel like I'm being stabbed in the heart. And the other day I felt, that what was most painful is, being Jewish, I felt this is being done in my name. I'm feeling this, as soon as I heard what was going on October the 7th, I foresaw, I think many of us did, it's not that I'm a psychic or anything, but I foresaw that this would be the result. And it was very much rereading Thai's work after 9/11, and his sense of, to help a nation to calm and say, if you act out of revenge, then you will just create a far greater problem. And I just foresaw that, we would probably end up in a mess, but not this level of mess. But just to come to the personal, what it brought up in me is a feeling of not being safe. So just a little bit of context. My mother and father were both refugees. My mother's family died in the Holocaust, and she got out alone as a young teenager to the UK, and my father's family were forced to flee Bulgaria before the war. And there was a lot of trauma in my family growing up, which was unrecognized and unspoken. So I think I swallowed the trauma. And so a lot of things for me about what it feels like to be at home, what it feels like to be safe. And I feel what I recognize now is most of my life I have not felt safe, and I have not felt at home. And I can see that through the generations of my ancestry, of that the world is not a safe place, and that any moment something can change, and one moment you're safe and the next moment you're in danger. So what's come up for me is on that day and post that is personally not feeling at home in the world. And that's created a lot of nervousness in me. I'm feeling sort of nervous, and I'm feeling, it's brought up that level of fear, and that has then touched into the collective, what I've been experiencing collectively, which is a couple of years ago I co-facilitated a 4-day convening in Denmark on collapse, on civilizational collapse, which brought 150 experts from around the world on collapse. And last night I was with someone who a few of you may have heard of, called Jamie Bristow, who set up the Mindfulness Initiative in the UK and has worked deeply in bringing mindfulness into politics and different parts of society. And he's now sort of looking also at collapse. And that what October the 7th brought out for me, and Post has brought out for me, is sort of a deeper awareness of what's going on in the world. You know, that we're now walking into what I feel is the blue skies darkening, the dark clouds coming in, and looking at all the polycrises and the now, very recently there's threat of war globally, not just in Gaza and Israel, but in Ukraine and Russia, with China and Taiwan, and just looking out at seeing that actually war and the prospect of war is very much upon us. It's not a theory, and that at any moment there can be a trigger, like in the Second World War, which triggers a huge conflagration of conflict. It's very, very possible. And then looking obviously at the climate crisis and then the biodiversity crisis, and just realizing that that actually we are heading into very dark times, and just deeply feeling that, and feeling the deep sadness, and seeing that actually there are going to be hundreds and hundreds of millions of refugees, just like my parents, and millions and millions and even billions of people not feeling safe anymore, not feeling at home, not feeling that they have ground to stand on. And then it comes back to the personal. So experiencing that collective worry about collapse brings back issues of resilience, because I'm not feeling very resilient at the moment. And I'm noticing that when I'm out of balance, that I'm being much more self-critical of myself. That when I'm in balance, when I've been in balance, that when things go wrong, I can quite easily course correct or take account of or understand and sort of, do the deep looking, the listening, course correct, understand what's going on and move through it. And that as I'm out of balance, so my mind is out of balance, and small things that may be going wrong or mistakes I'm making are ballooning out and reaching sort of much larger proportions in my mind. So I'm noticing just that sense of what we are collectively feeling around the world. And lastly, the other thing that's been very much on my mind is sort of watching people like Trump and Netanyahu and these powerful individuals who, through ambition and the wish to protect themselves, are destroying entire ways of seeing, and are, for their own personal gain, are destroying norms, and seeing how many people are prepared to follow that collapse of norms. And so it's just watching, both within myself and at a distance, what that looks like and the risks of that. And then from that, sort of saying, well, what does create resilience? And the 14 mindfulness trainings are pretty good, manual for that. Taking care of our suffering, building community. All these different things are. So when you say about ancient paths to modern times, I think that these trainings are the raft to grab onto in stormy seas. They are that we are going to be called on to really get in touch with our deep humanity and to strip away all this nonsense that we've been fed of capitalism, of consumption and individualization and all that we know. And that is just being, it's like a plaster and it's just going to be torn off. It's being torn away from us. And we're going to have to face that wound because it hasn't been healed. And we're going to have to say, what is the healing that we're going to sort of take? And Jamie Bristow, last night we were talking about, there's techno-optimists on one side who say, don't worry, it's all going to be sorted by technology. And the other side, they're the doomers who say, there's no hope. And what we're doing is often getting caught between just that sort of, not the optimism that Christiana Figueres talks about, but this sort of naive optimism, and then the people saying, well, the nihilists saying, well, we're going to collapse, let's have a good time. And Jamie and I were both talking, because I agree, I have a great sense of agreement with him that collapse into renewal, that there is some sort of collapse happening, but the capacity is for a deep renewal, and that we have to wake up. This is Thai's teachings. And he says, if we don't wake up, the civilization will collapse. It's inevitable. And that the only way the only way is if there's a collective awakening. Will we avoid that? And of course, collapse has many layers, levels. But I think it may be that there will be some sort of collapse, and that our work, individually and collectively, is to build the resilience and understanding and the sharings and how these teachings spread out into the world that help people to, in difficult times, to know how to respond and not to go into despair and not to go into nihilism and not to go into this deep insecurity that leads to protection and withdrawal, but to say, can that lead to deeper openness, deeper sharing, deeper collaboration, a deeper sense of localism? And the answer is we don't know yet, because it can go either way. And so I think each of us individually can start to make that difference, and we need to make that difference now. It's not saying, Thai's teachings were always, you practice in the good times, so that when the bad, difficult times come, you're prepared to do that. You're prepared to act because you've already practiced. And if we wait for a possible collapse before we start practicing, then it's too late because we go into panic. So I think, everyone who is engaged in Thai's work, is engaged in the order of interbeing that wants to make a difference, this is the time to do it now, not in 5-10 years.
Thank you, Jo. Maybe before we go on, we have one sound of the bell, and we can all breathe together. From what you just shared, Jo, there's about 10 themes I'd like to draw out on. But I'll just stick with two for the moment. One is the idea of home. And I think the Plum Village community and being, especially the OI community, were very much dedicated to building community, building Sangha as a place of refuge, as kind of like a spiritual home for many. And so I want to explore a little bit about that. And, sometimes it's not easy feeling at home. First of all, it's extremely difficult to feel at home in ourselves. Challenge number one, let alone to feel at home in a community. And then also to build a community that can be a home for many. So I just want to explore a little bit on that theme and maybe how you've been able to do that in your life, personal or professional. And the other theme, I'm just going to say in case I forget, and then you can answer or pick up the thread as you please. The other theme I'm picking up on is for each of us. I think of course it's very important to have this journey where we can look deeply into the roots of our suffering. And so you've been through that journey. And in the 14 mindfulness trainings, there is a training on the awareness of suffering. And it's an encouragement for us not to run away from our suffering, to look, to have enough courage and enough stopping, enough time to really look and understand the roots of our suffering. And then there's another training on which is almost the opposite, dwelling happily in the present moment. So I'm just curious how you find the balance of those two. The need to really look deeply into our suffering and to identify the roots and to embrace it, to heal and to transform. And then the other training, we are determined to learn the art of mindful living by touching the wondrous, refreshing, and healing elements that are inside and around us in all situations. So how are you practicing as OI members? How are you practicing with this? So first of all, you can pick up any theme, home, or this looking deeply into suffering and the balance between that and living happily in the present moment.
Happily, I think they inter-are, finding a home, embracing my suffering, and dwelling happily in the present moment. I was sitting here listening and I could feel my heart going up as Jo was sharing, just coming back, one of our trainings that I love to look into. I love, again, the scholarship side of TWOII in our practice, that we have theories and frameworks that we can hold up as mirrors to our lived experience. That's something we do with the 14. And in this moment, the one coming up for me as I think about how have I been approaching my fear, my anxiety, the unsettled parts of myself that I am also feeling from what is going on, close to me and in the world, that we are not separate from that. And I've been thinking a lot about, where are spaces of safety and home? So I want to share where I have been cultivating that and how that shows up in my life, both in what we might call our personal and professional, but we know from TWOII, I was with him at Google, he was like, those are not separate. But I will use them as words because that's helpful. But the framework that was coming up for me was the 4 nutriments, if anyone's familiar with that. And in our 14, we talk about consumption. And so in our practice, I wanted to just bring in this language so that I can talk about how I'm cultivating home and looking into my suffering and happiness right now. So I guess the Coles notes, I don't know if that translates over into Europe. It's like this book for getting the cheat sheet, the short review of the 4 nutriments, looking into what we consume beyond edible food. So the first being what we eat, then our sense impressions, what we take in from our eyes, our ears. For myself and with my Sangha and my students, we're talking a lot about what are we consuming through our technology right now and how are we consuming it. and then consuming our volition, and then consciousness, which is, I think, so interesting in our practice, where, I mean, all of them are, but that we are invited to really become aware. We're thinking in the framing of becoming aware of the suffering that may come from my consumption of things beyond edible foods. What is my relationship? Sometimes I like to say, like with a bag of potato chips, I like to get very practical. Here's how I'm doing it in my daily life. I really like potato chips, and there's a healthy way for me to consume them. Maybe I am like, I'm working, I'm gonna put this many potato chips into a bowl, and I'll just eat that bowl, and that can be a very happy experience of crunching on potato chips. Or I can like open the whole bag and be like working on my emails and consuming text on my phone, and I eat the whole bag without realizing it. And then I suffer. I don't feel so well. And so I like to think about this in relationship to my sense impressions, the conversations I'm having, the media I'm consuming. You know, am I thoughtfully putting some boundaries, putting a certain amount that I'm going to consume, or am I just opening my brain and pouring in all that information and maybe having a upset physiological and mental response? And going further with my volition, right? My drive, my motivation to do in the world. And we heard from our first panelists, and I know so many of you I've spoken to who are here, we have this real volition to do in the world. And then this beautiful question from our teachings: how are we consuming that? Am I consuming my drive to build Sangha, to care for our planet, to care for myself in a way that is healthy, or in a way that is overwhelming me, perhaps leading to burnout? And then with consciousness, to be aware that I consume my own consciousness. So we've heard a lot about this from the earlier trainings, right? Our thoughts, we consume them first. They lead to our actions. So there's that internal consumption. Oh, I had a bunch of thoughts about how I was going to do on this panel today. I was consuming them last night. I was like, is that the food I want to be eating? I changed what I was consuming. I thought about offering to the Sangha the things I love about my work, the humans I would be here with. Consuming that felt very different. And then that collective consciousness, and Jo spoke to this already, you know, it's feeling the pain of the world and knowing that I am consuming that. I've also made a choice to be here for these 2 weeks to consume this consciousness. And that really impacts the landscape of my mind. And so that's a question I have as a practitioner often, to look around in my day-to-day life and ask, holding up the 4 nutriments, what am I consuming beyond edible foods? And how is this impacting my internal landscape? And Christiana shared very beautifully, then we are the ones that go into those spaces and speak. That systems change may be deeply personal. I think as a researcher, like, we're that consistent factor where we go. And so how am I contributing to the landscapes of consciousness around me? And so coming back to this question of not feeling safe, of not maybe feeling at home. And I can see when I don't have ways of connecting into community, connecting in and feeling safe within myself, it's almost impossible to be the human I would like to be in the world. To step into maybe a difficult meeting where I know there's going to be different viewpoints, and to meet those views with love and compassion. I know if I sit down to grade, I teach some undergraduate courses at the university, if I sit down to grade papers and I am not settled in myself, you know, I love to guide, to iterate, to develop students' writing, but maybe I will just give my critiques. I will forget to write, this sentence was wonderful, what seeds do I water? I have a deep commitment, actually, as a teacher, or before I go into meetings with my colleagues, to really look at the landscape of my mind, to be committed to bringing myself to each of those interactions in a way that is of love and understanding. And I have seen more challenges in this year, as things have felt so unsettled in the world, as I've consumed that consciousness. My husband, Rob, is here, so if you want to hear from him, how consuming the world can lead me to come home and be unskillful in my speech. what I consume in the day, how hard I push myself, that shows up right when I sit down to eat a meal. Because I always like to say our practice is to turn towards suffering and embrace it. And for me, the spaces where I feel safe are ones where that permission is given. And when that permission is given, then we also have the opportunity to touch happiness. The other thing I want to mention about this was, as I shared, I also do research at the hospitals with physicians, with allied healthcare professionals. In October, as the wars were starting on campus, we had daily readings of names of family members of students who had lost their lives. And that was quite a collective consciousness to all be consuming on campus. And my class was in the afternoon, and one of the afternoons, one of these readings was going to happen halfway through the class, just outside our window. And so we came in, we'd been practicing together for about a month. I just asked the students what they needed that day. And we had students in this class, international students. I had students in my class from Israel and Palestine, some of whom had lost family members. And we moved the chairs to the side of the room, and we just sat quietly together, and I was asked to lead a compassion practice. And in that space of academia, everyone's come prepared that day to read peer-reviewed journal articles and critique them. And all those students also came prepared to sit together and hold space for tears, to breathe. So we did not run away from the suffering. We really invited it in. We sat together and held it. And then after we sat, I asked them what they wanted to do. And some of them lit up. They're like, am I allowed to be excited about talking about the articles we read this week? And so this just brings me to the happiness part. And our teaching on multiple truths, that perhaps we are allowed and to give ourselves permission, and this is something I'm practicing with, in really challenging times. Our trainings invite us, they encourage us to turn towards and embrace our suffering and dwell happily in the present moment. That's how we get the energy to hold these spaces, to keep doing the work we want to do. And so in that moment, the first half of class, we were with our suffering. We did not ask it to leave. In fact, I said, we can bring it with us into the next conversation. And then we had this lively and joyful time debating peer-reviewed journal articles and how the measurements of mindfulness were going in the current field. And there was laughter, and there was playfulness, and there was fun. So for me, that's a very deep part of this training is, and a growing edge of my practice. How do I give myself permission to really engage with, embrace, and turn towards suffering? What are the practices I have? How do I offer that to my communities? And then how does that also allow for us to touch happiness in the present moment? And so multiple truths, I'm gonna pick on Rob because he's here. It is true that I can deeply love Rob and be kind of frustrated with him, like that's true. And to hold that on a greater level, right, that systems are made of individuals, we can perhaps be really overwhelmed by, even outraged at actions being taken by our collective human family. And at the same time, just like if Rob doesn't do the dishes, I'm a little frustrated. I can still deeply love and care for all of my human family. A practice.
I'd like to add one more element to that home question. Because speaking of home, I'm not sure if everyone would agree, but most would agree that most homes have some kind of dysfunction. And I want to say this, but I want you to understand I'm very much Team PV. And I know many of you in the room are very much Team PV, but it doesn't mean we can't recognize the dysfunction that is in our home, in our community, in our sanghas, etc. So the other part of the home building, community building homes is how do you recognize and practice with the dysfunctions that you recognize in the community, and maybe in particular, how do you, when we feel misunderstood by our community, first of all, what's that experience like, and how do we practice with it? How do we stick with the community even through misunderstanding? Yeah.
Well, that will take us to dinner time, I think. So the first time I deeply understood home was when my wife and I first had tea with Thai. But I just want to go back a bit. When I was a reasonably young man, around 28, I think, I was working in New York, and it was clear that I was a bit sort of screwed up in my own beautiful way. So I went to see a psychoanalyst, a sort of Jungian analyst, and on the first question he asked me was probably the most important one. He said, "What do you hope to gain from being here?" And I realized I hadn't actually thought of the question, and my immediate answer was that I feel I've been at war with myself my whole life, and I just want to find some peace. And it really helped me to realize that I had been at war with myself all my life. I used to have sort of daydreams. I'd get on a train to go to work, and I'd imagine terrorists coming on the train and attacking it. And it was very interesting that yesterday on the meditation walk, we walked down towards the forest, and there was one shot of a gun. You could hear gunfire, because obviously here there's hunting, and sometimes you hear gunfire. And I've been here for 4 years, and when I hear that gunfire, no impact on me. It's just like, oh, they're shooting, and that's, sad they're shooting, but it hasn't had a personal impact on me. And as soon as I heard the gunfire, I looked for a place to hide. I thought, oh, if they come for us, I could grab Paz, and there's a little bush up there, we can go that way. And it was really like quite a shock to me to think that is still running in my mind. So when Paz and I first came here, we were married in this hall by Sister Chang Kong, God bless her. And then Thai invited us for tea the next day. And again, he asked a very simple question. He said, how have you enjoyed these last 2 weeks? And I said, Thai, they've been two of the happiest weeks of my life. And he said, can you explain more? And I said, it's the first time I've ever felt at home in myself. That it was the first time I'd ever felt that I had dropped the armor, and I'd dropped the critical voices and the internal warfare, and that I was actually present, fully present. And then he asked Paz, have you enjoyed your 2 weeks? And Paz said, and at that time we were staying in Upper Hamlet here, and there were no other women, so it was like, and it was during a winter retreat, so it was about 200 men. And Paz said, it's the first time that I've been amongst so many men and felt safe. And a few days later, Thai gave his Christmas talk, and he referred to that conversation. He said, when a woman feels safe, she's at home. And I think he said, I'm not sure if this is right, he said in Vietnamese, your marriage partner is called home. And so he said, well, when they say, where's your wife? You say, my home is at the post office, or my home's gone shopping, or my home is doing this. So I really understood deeply what home is. Home is to be at peace, for me, within myself. That what Thai refers to as that non-stop noise in the mind, or non-stop radio, just fell away, and I was just here. And that's very beautiful. And it was a moment, and of course, but it's a moment I know to be my truth and my place. And so whenever things are difficult, it's a place I can come back to. And also, Thai had to work hard to find what home was for him. He was exiled for 39 years. He didn't know. He had no home for a while, no country home until France accepted him, and so he also had to work out that home is where I am. I think that we have to find home inside of ourselves, that we can't find it outside of ourselves. In terms of your second question about suffering and joy, I think because they inter-are, you can't separate them. So our joy is in our suffering, and our suffering is in our joy. So to try and even separate them out is itself a mistake. The understanding I've reached at the moment is, and especially with all the leaders I coach, is that we find our truth in the balance of forces. I often use the metaphor of a children's seesaw in a playground. And for a seesaw to be fun, you have to have someone on each end, and someone kicking up and you going down, and then you kicking up and the other person going down. And I think often my experience of people is they're sitting at one end of the seesaw, and the other one is empty. And when you're at one end on the ground, you're crouched up. There's no space in you. You're just, your whole body is like a fetus position on the ground, and there's no movement. There's no flexibility. There's no joy in it. And what I often do is help people to also sit on the other end, and to say it's in the interplay of the suffering and the joy that we find meaning. And the meaning we eventually find is the fulcrum of the seesaw, because the seesaw balances on a fulcrum. And the fulcrum is in the center, and it is grounded. And so it's the place in which everything moves. But it's very hard to find the fulcrum if we haven't experienced the ups and downs of the seesaw. So one short story about joy and suffering. My mother, when she left Germany, she was, I think, 14. She was put on a train, some distant relative. It was after Kristallnacht, so their apartment had just been smashed up by the Nazis. And my grandfather had been begging for these relatives to take my mother in. And they said no, and then after Kristallnacht they said yes. So she was put on a train, and she waved goodbye to her father on the station. And when she was telling me the story, I was imagining this story of immense sadness. She was 14 on a train on her own, leaving her home country, leaving her father, not knowing where her brother was. And so I was expecting her and wanting her to tell a story only of suffering. And so she told me how difficult it was to leave. And then she said, but you know what? I was so excited because I was going on an adventure. And I didn't know what was to come of me, but I was really looking forward to this adventure. And I'm so grateful to my mother for telling me that story, because she was feeling all the suffering and she was feeling excitement and joy. And even in that circumstance, she was able to feel both. And there was something really, I felt it was a great gift in that moment to tell me that we so often get caught in this duality that if we're feeling sad, then we're not allowed to feel joy, because that diminishes the sadness. It negates the sadness. So you can't tell a joke at this point, or you can't enjoy something because you're supposed to be sad. If someone has died, you only have to feel one thing. And that in our joy, that it's not possible to feel sadness in our joy because we should be happy. You know, if you're happy, you shouldn't let the sadness come in. And so we built this sort of this binary code within ourselves that it's either one or the other, and meaning is never found in one or the other. It's found, you know, in the middle way. And your third question, sister, about practicing with imperfection, I think. So often people come to Plum Village, and if they come for a week, they believe they've come to heaven on earth. And they have come to heaven on earth. If you live here for 4 years, you recognize that heaven also has its problems. And what I've come to recognize is, you know, in my relationship, particularly with the monks and nuns, that the monks and nuns are people. They're people. They're people. Yeah, they really are just people. And I think there's a great danger in mythologizing the monastics, because then we expect things from you rather than share things with you or be shared from you. And I was just in Deer Park Monastery in California. I'm on the board of the Thich Nhat Hanh Foundation, and there was the first board retreat there for 5 years. And one of the lay practitioners who's on the board was saying, I just want to be breathing the same air as the monastics. I just want to get close enough so I breathe the same air. And I was saying, yeah, okay, whatever, you know. I was about to say, well, that's carbon dioxide, actually, you know. But, you know, I know monastics who've been here a year and 20 and 30 years, and we are all of us, not just monastics, we're all facing into our difficulties. And listening to Sister Chanduk in her Dharma talk, I thought I'd been practicing very well with anger, you know, and then at lunchtime I got very angry. You know, when I was young, I did a lot of personal development work with this wish that if I worked hard enough, these problems would go away, because what I wanted was these problems to go away. I didn't want to ever face them again. I just wanted them out of my life, and I wanted to be free of them. And so all my work was to get rid of them. And I now realize I will take them with me to my last breath. And that the best I can do is to understand them, to befriend them, to see the value in them, and to work with them as best I can. And that's true of the monastics. You know, I see monastics who issues come up for them, traumas or something, things that they had as children, they face all the same problems. And so one of the things I feel is most important is to take away the expectation and the need from the monastics, because otherwise you can end up getting too close and getting disappointed and thinking, well, what, you know, these people who come and have this wonderful view of, you know, they don't really see the truth of it. Whereas in fact, as Elli said, there are many truths. And what I love, the reason I love Plum Village and the monastics is because of the humility, because you share your issues, because you share your sufferings. And I find that the most courageous thing. There are so many spiritual traditions where the teachers are on pedestals and they just tell you, do this, do that, and you'll get nirvana. And there's no pedestal in Plum Village. And that this was TWOII's amazing teaching. And there was once where we went on a meditation walk, actually like Lower Hamlet, to those woods where we all sat down by the river. And we'd arrived a bit late, and TWOII was sitting on his small bamboo mat. And we were standing a little bit away, and he beckoned Paz and I over. And we were a bit reluctant. He said, come over. And then he shared his mat with us. He said, come and sit either side of me. And we sat on his mat. And that is what Plum Village is. You see it all. You see the wounds, and the important thing is not to judge those wounds, but to realize, to have compassion for the wounds of the monastics in the same way I have compassion for other people. So, and when I get frustrated occasionally, the way I've understood it is that I'm here for the Dharma, not for the monastics. And so I'm here because these teachings are deep, and it's a deep flowing river that has helped me transform my way of seeing the world, and I know is what we need in these modern times. And that I'm not here for the monastics, because the monastics are here for the teachings too. So where are we all in common? We're all here because of the Dharma and the Buddha. And that with all the imperfections are part of the beauty. And never to mistake that for weakness, but to actually see the immense courage in showing the wounds.
Well, here's the thing. You know, when I'm going to just share a little bit of my reaction, even though you're beautiful sharing. I did have a little bit of a reaction when you said us and the monastics. I really did, because I remember the first great ordination ceremony that I attended in Plum Village. And I witnessed Tay offer the lamp to monastic Dharma teachers and lay Dharma teachers. And also, and so for each lamp he would transmit. I just remember, it was so beautiful to me, because for every person, monastic or lay, he would recognize a field of action that they kind of shined in or really invested a lot of their life in. And he really watered their seeds in this field of action. And, you know, whether it was a person who is in the teaching profession or in health or in research, and each lamp that he transmitted, he really kind of spoke a little bit about their fields of action and how they can, you know, and just really acknowledging how they're bringing mindfulness and the practice into the fields that they were in out in the world. And when I witnessed this, it was such, I just felt, that entrusting is so beautiful. And then in my mind, I had a vision of the Plum Village community as being, okay, well, monastics are here, we do our thing here, but there are thousands and thousands of lay practitioners who are doing their thing out in the world. You know, it may look different from what we're doing here in Plum Village, but it's also about bringing the practice of mindfulness into the many different areas. So I always thought the lay, especially the OI community, as being like extensions of the Plum Village community. And it wasn't a different body. It wasn't an us and them. But weirdly enough, the more senior I get in the community, and I'm still very young compared to my others, I've only been here 20 years, but I find the more senior I get in the community, there's this expectation that we are teachers of the Dharma, and then slowly, there's this us and them, which I never felt in my heart in the beginning. And I know Brother Phapu and some of us mention quite often that, you know what, when we ordained, we never expected to be anybody's teacher. We just wanted to ordain for the practice. And it's just, yeah, so, but I understand it is a kind of responsibility that, you know, to step into, to learn, and etc. But for me personally, I do want to do it in such a way that I see us as one body, a multifold body, and not an us and them. What am I expecting as a layperson from the monastics? What am I as a monastic expecting from you as, and even there, I feel like I need to go and rinse my mouth like 10 times just to get that kind of separation away. So as one reaction, I was having to your sharing a little bit. So how can we go together as a river? I think that is where it's leading me. And for Elli, I think you're in terms of speaking of going together as a river, not just monastic and lay, but maybe younger generation, older generation, younger Dharma teachers, older, more senior Dharma teachers, or how are you finding, what are some of the challenges that you are facing in terms of community building with bridging the understanding between the younger generation of practitioners to the more senior, seasoned practitioners? That's where my consciousness is taking me in this conversation.
I think I can feel a little bit of some of my volition, my deep love, having grown up in this tradition, is this single body. In children's program with the monastics, we play, we practice, we do some art together, we sing. Having then moved through the teen program and Wake Up, we had the opportunity to be on tour, on these small tours, some of us, as the first Wake Up Sanghas were started in the United States. We went on a tour, I think with 11 monastics and 7 lay people, and we lived and practiced together and got this incredible transmission of what it means to work, practice, and play in harmony, to organize. And I'm always really curious, the term I sometimes like to use, what's the thought technology at the practice center? And then how am I adapting and iterating that into my daily life? I'll come back to challenges of intergenerational. This was inspiring to think, when I get to come here, I feel like there's this beautiful exchange of spaces. Sister Nghiem on the first panel shared, what is the engaged practice here right now? I love that idea that Thai entrusted lay Dharma teachers and also those of us in the brown robe and anyone who comes to retreat entrusted with these practices and this knowledge to go out into the world and take that action. And so how do each of us do that? I just want to bring in this idea of what are the spheres of influence that we have? Each one of us has an area, a field of action, whether it's just within ourselves, our families, where we work, maybe global politics. Each of us, have spaces. And so something I've always loved about this community is that we are this river, this body that has different perspectives, and that leads to some mud also. This is what we were kind of coming into, is Plum Village is a reflection of the world, I think, just like Thai so beautifully has us practicing eating and walking meditation, because we do those every day of our lives. So to concentrate on an activity we do every day, and then to see how to transform that filters into so much of what we do in our lives. But I hear feeling despair at, there being disagreement in the Sangha, or that there's different perspectives, different social cultural roots that are using different language. And of course that is here, and it doesn't mean, as we said, to not have frustration or concern or difficulty, and the challenges we are facing in terms of language, of bias, of in and out group distinctions, of othering, that is also here, and that can be really painful. And for me, there's this opportunity then to hold that up in the safety and light of this space and ask it some really good questions. And so I see this as one of the challenges also in some of our lay communities. You may hear some of us have been iterating this term fourfold Sangha to multifold Sangha. And that comes from feedback from our Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ community on that language. And always to remind ourselves, like from TWOII, this transmission we have, good practitioners make it the language of their times. And so I love being part of a living tradition that is invited to iterate, that is invited to look. And so I think that we have challenges of different perspectives, different generations. So I think we have, not to oversimplify it, the challenges of our world are here. TWOII always said and never wanted the monastery to be separate from the world. So I love that invitation to be one body, and as that body to recognize that that is all here. And actually we want it to be here because we want, at least for myself, we want to not turn away from our suffering. We want to look at it clearly. We want to call it by its true names. When we can call it by its true names together, we have the opportunity maybe for some transformation and healing.
So, taking a very wide lens on this first, if you look at the sort of meta change we're seeing in the system at the moment is very much from sort of globalization back to localization. And one thing globalization did a lot of was destroy local communities and destroy local identities and local connections, because everything went to in a sense, what was most efficient and what was cheapest and what was this and what was that, and that all sucked community out. So if we look at, what is the age we may be walking into, and it is an age of re-community, so bringing community back in. And we saw that, and this is quite a UK-centric thing, but it spread internationally. We saw that many years ago with the transition town movement, recognizing that actually as we are shifting from one system towards the next, that actually individual towns, individual communities need to be prepared for that. We see that in terms of bioregions, in terms of regions recognizing they have to be more sustainable and more self-sufficient. So I actually think, and I think this in many ways, that TWOII's teachings are becoming more and more and more relevant, that they're not moving away from relevance, they're moving actually into deeper relevance in many forms. So TWOII's work on community building is just critical, and it's very easy to talk about community building and just stop there, but being present in Plum Village and looking at how do you make decisions? How do you look at issues? Who is heard and who is not heard? How do you bring everyone into the ability to hear their voices? Taking time for deep looking, not jumping to instant conclusions, or not thinking, there's a pressure from the outside world, we need to act now or we need to respond now, but just saying, what is it to actually sit with an issue and look deeply into it, hear people's voices, and what it's like to let go of one's own individual view, preference, in service to the broader community, and those that system that you've created is in this world very revolutionary, and I think people are starting to take notice of it and say, how do we incorporate that into the way we make decisions? So I think just from a back to the technology of community, you have a technology, an ancient technology that I think is going to be incredibly useful. TWOII always said that if you try and develop your meditation practice and your mindfulness practice as an individual, it's not going to work. So we do need community, and also there's something community about trust in the broader community. I remember when I interviewed Thai once, and I said, Thai, to be perfectly honest, the reason I'm in Plum Village is because of you. That your practice and your teachings have been forged in the white heat of your own suffering and your own life experience. And I said, but there are many young monastics here who haven't necessarily lived much in the outside world. Why on earth would I want to place any trust in them? I'm here for you, not for them. And he said, very simple, he said, everything that happens outside the monastery happens inside the monastery. So whatever we feel we're facing outside the monastery in our own particular way, the monastics are facing that in their particular way. And so I think community is also about, what you're saying, Elli, is about allowing all those voices to be relevant and not discriminating, saying, oh, well, which I was doing, of course. I was saying, Thai, I'm here for you. Get rid of the rest of them. I just want you. And was very skillful in just a few words of saying, no, we're all part of this. So I think community building is what's needed in the 21st century. And just going back to speaking with Jamie Bristow last night, he's just done this paper for family and friends actually about what he's seeing coming up and responses to it. And one of the key ones is to band together and to start building resilience into community. Because you can't just have community and it's all just it's just everyone meeting and talking and sharing. I think we have to add the aspect of what is it that develops a resilient community. Because whatever communities we're in, we're going to have to face resilience issues. And that will bring community building into the real, into the hard edge of reality. That it won't just be gatherings, it will be, I was about to say, it could be even survival, and I know for many communities in parts of the world, community is survival, actually. So, I'm talking from a very Western-centric viewpoint. And if we look to areas of the world, we see that all that saves those communities is the community. And that when things are at their most difficult, often we find that people are at their most generous. And, people always talk about this, that, you can go to a very, very poor community and people offer you their bed and will offer you their food. And you go to a rich gated community and you won't get to the doorbell before you're challenged. You'll be shushed away. So I think there's one thing that the resilience, in a sense, will come from the challenges. It's hard to. That's why it's hard to plan for it, because our minds look just at the end of our nose and think, well, everything's okay at the moment, so I don't need to do anything. And it's a failure of humanity that we don't see far enough ahead and act in the present moment, that we tend to act in the present moment from what we're experiencing now. So that's where it's not actually living in the present moment, it's acting from a narrow view of the present moment because to be fully in the present moment is to know that it's impacting the future. And so we have to bring the future into the present moment, whereas most people's actions are based only on the present moment view. So I think, unfortunately, it's only when times are difficult that we will rediscover the power of community and the power of interbeing. Only when we are suffering deeply that we will recognize that actually we have to band together and we have to be generous and give the little we have rather than try to amass as much as we have.
Thank you, Jo. I told you I will disagree with you. I'm just kidding. No, I think, there's also a power of banding together when we are feeling well. When a community is happy and healthy, I find that's a very easy time to band together. So not just to wait until we're like all falling apart to band together. This is the time, this is it. And what I'm picking up in terms of community building, and I just want to share what's been quite alive for me recently. One aspect, because you mentioned about resilience and also about how can everyone's voices be heard. And I find this, it sounds very appealing, but practically it's very challenging. Sit in a meeting and 10 different ideas, or sometimes ideas coming from you have no idea where, and you think, does that even make sense? Or, many reactions I have oftentimes hearing the many different voices. Some I agree with, some I don't. Some I agree with more, some I agree with less, and not at all. So I find this aspect of community building, how to keep communications open, very, very challenging, and also how to keep my own heart open, very challenging. And so one of the practices that have come up with me, and just remembering some of my own experiences, for instance, my understanding of the Vietnam War. For instance, I was born in Vietnam. My family emigrated to America when I was 6. And, I was at a very young age. My parents don't speak much about the Vietnam War. All I know is we're in a different country and trying our best to adapt, learning the language, my parents trying their best to support the family, et cetera, and just being in this environment where I'm slowly learning the language, but I'm always kind of the outsider. I understand what's going on, but always feeling the outsider. So this is very much my experience, a little bit of the war, the after effects, the aftermaths of the war. And I never really bothered to learn about the Vietnam War because, all I know is that's what took my family out of the country. And that's what, that's what removed us out of the country. That's why we're in the situation that we are in right now. And that's my lived experience of the idea of this Vietnam War. I remember going, in schools and things like that. I remember, for instance, President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, was kind of portrayed as the Prince Charming of all the presidents, So you grow up with this idea, etc., and not bothering to look so deeply into the war and who did what and things like that. Much later, I find out, he's the president who authorized napalm and first jet fighters to bomb South Vietnam at the time, and much of my hometown as well was very affected by then. So that's one reality, and yet I was totally indoctrinated into this other system where here's a very charming president, and kind of they call the Kennedys the royalties of America, something like that. So I hear these things and I have a different impression, and also very much my education in the U.S. was, whenever the Vietnam War is mentioned, it's always about communism and being anti-communist and things like that. So I grew up with this rhetoric. And in myself, I have a feeling, maybe it has to do with the communists that my family is here now, things like that. I don't do much deep looking or deep research into this war. And it wasn't actually a few years ago that when we're showing the film of Tay, A Cloud Never Dies, and we have a group of practitioners from Vietnam coming, and they were, their family had contributed to the liberation, unification of Vietnam. They're communists. And they watched this movie, A Cloud Never Dies, and a part of it speaks a little bit about the Vietnam War. And so I watch it, and these are all the images I've seen growing up and things like that whenever the Vietnam War is mentioned. And our friends, when they watched this documentary, A Cloud Never Died, they had a completely different reaction. Completely different reaction, almost feeling hurt about it. And now these are friends that, you know, I've spoken to, we interacted a little bit. They're not standing at the opposite side of this war. They're not kind of like the enemies as I have grown up to know them to be. And I found it very interesting. The more I looked into the Vietnam War, just the different kinds of indoctrination that I had been kind of privy to, that I had been experiencing, versus the reality that I was in, and my own my own family experience of it. And so in the Sangha the word that has been very much alive in my mind right now is the word indoctrination. And how do we even free ourselves from that? Even being indoctrinated into Plum Village teachings, for instance. Because when we have a view, so my own practice right now is, if I have a view and someone else has an opposite view of me, you know, instead of saying, oh, how was that person indoctrinated into that view? I'm spending a lot of time like looking into how I am being indoctrinated into the view that I have. And it makes it so much easier to understand and then to start to hear the voice of the other person. I just want to share that piece about my practice in terms of keeping communications open. How am I being indoctrinated into this view, this understanding that I have right now, even if it is a Buddhist? And I mean, of course, Tay, he knew this. So he was like, even Buddhist teachings. We are committed to seeing the Buddhist teachings as guiding means that help us develop our understanding and compassion. They are not doctrines to fight, kill, or die for. I've forgotten which one that says even Buddhist teachings. Anyhow, you can read the 14 mindfulness trainings later. But I've always been very, whenever that comes up, I'm like, why would I question that? But now I think, in terms of being open, keeping an openness, in order to allow space for another view to come in or another person's experience to come in. I think looking into my own indoctrination of anything is quite important, and that's how I'm keeping my heart open.
Sister, just to add a little bit to that, and you speak so clearly on this, that we need to challenge our worldviews, because we all have our worldviews. It's why we get decolonization, all these other ways of that we need to see in new ways. And when I did my master's degree, there was one moment where we were talking about economics. It was around, the master's was in sustainability and business practice. And there was a Western economist talking about economics from the Western perspective, and then they invited in an African economist who had a completely different way of seeing economy. And so that's why we need to, which is what you're describing, we need to educate ourselves into different worldviews, because as you say, it's so deep within us that we're completely unaware. And of course, that's why there's so many dangers with the contraction of real journalism into just misinformation and individual bubbles where people just confirm their belief system, because that is, so intensely dangerous, because what you're describing is going one way, and there are many, many millions of people going very rapidly in the other direction of saying, actually, I'll choose my own truth. I don't need to, the facts are just there to be manipulated, and I can make up my own facts. And this is just, terrible time. I was in Mexico recently, and I met up with this this journalist who'd been a local journalist in Texas. And he was just bemoaning the fact that, there were no longer any journalists sitting on the local government committees, the energy committee or this committee. And so all accountability had gone. There was no one to report on what was going on. So the only narrative was the official narrative, which could be manipulated at will. And I always say, as a journalist at The Guardian, there are very simple steps you go through to check your information. Don't just take it from one source. Use your common sense. I mean, this is, again, Thai's teachings that don't just take things for granted, but say, does this really ring true? And Thai's calligraphy, are you sure? And I think, Elli, you were saying your parents got a calligraphy from Thai saying, are you sure? And if you think you are, check, or something like that. Check again. So I think it's for each of us individually to take that responsibility for saying, having another look and just challenging what our belief systems are, because that is the separation. That is what separates and others. Dear friends, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion and found some real value in it. If you like this episode, then you can find all the other episodes of The Way Out is In on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and in fact any platform that has podcasts. If you'd like to support the work of Plum Village, you can donate at thichnathanfoundation.org/donate. I hope you are well and happy, and see you next time.
The way out is in.